Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Today I have four fantastic experts, and I'm a little too much echo. Okay, let's try again. A little too much echo. Turn me down, please. Okay, let's try again. Good afternoon. My name is Melinda Herring. I'm the editor of the Ukraine Alert blog here at the Atlantic Council. We're delighted to see so many people interested in Ukraine's elections. I'm joined with four fantastic experts. To my immediate left is Ambassador John Herbst, the director of the Eurasia Center. To his left, Natalie Bagaeva from the Institute for the Study of War. To her left, Carl Gershwin, the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. And on the far left is Dr. Anders Oslin, my colleague at the Atlantic Council. You can't really ask for a better panel. We're going to get into everything. So we have about an hour discussion, moderated discussion, and then we have about 25 minutes where we're going to take your questions. So let me give you the latest and greatest. The count is not finished yet. It's at about 91%. Right now, it looks like Volodymyr Zelensky, the inexperienced comedian, came out on top with 30%. Incumbent Petro Poroshenko is about at 16%. He's just a little under 16%. And Tymoshenko is at 13%. Number 4 is Boyko at 11.5%, and Gritsenko is at 7%. So I want to jump in now and turn to Dr. Anders Oslin. We all know who Petro Poroshenko is. He's been the president for the last 5 years. Anders, who is Volodymyr Zelensky, and is he more than a project of a Ukrainian oligarch?
Zelensky has been a very successful businessman. His production company has about 1,000 people. This is not nobody. This is a person who has been in the tough of Ukrainian business, but in the good side of it. And he has managed to stay out of all dirty schemes as far as we know today. The one suspicious thing is that he has made his career on Kolomoisky's very successful and popular channel 1+1. But he has provided, through his production company, with the most successful program. And anybody who wants to know about Zelensky will, of course, look upon this wonderful servant of the people. And if you think that Zelensky is naive, if you have seen this series, you can say that he's not at all naive. He understands how Ukraine really works. The question is, of course, if he's prepared to do something about it. But then we have that his two top economic advisors today are the two most highly recognized economic reformers in the last 5 years, I would say. Ivaras Abramovichus, former Minister of Economy, and Alexander Danilyuk, the former Minister of Finance. Two heavyweight ministers who managed to stay out of all scandals and protested against quite a few of the scandals. And they are now clearly running his economic policy. There are many things we don't know, but what we know, apart from the Kolomoisky connection, is pretty reassuring.
John, could you tell us, you're the only panelist on our stage who's actually met Zelensky. Can you tell us about your impression of him, and does he have a national security team in place that you know
of? I did meet with him. His reputation is he does not know much about domestic politics, about the economy, and about national security affairs. And to his credit, he did not deny it. He struck me as a man of serious common sense. It was clear that he wanted to portray himself as a reformer, so when I met with him, Danilyuk was there. But again, we don't know to what extent Danilyuk really has his ear. Mm-hmm. And while we're a little bit reassured that Abramovich and Danilyuk are in the room with him, there are no comparable people on the national security side. And it's very important that if he winds up being the next president of Ukraine, and I say if, we should not get ahead of ourselves, that he have a strong national security team.
Okay, very good. So I'd like to ask the big question, what's at stake for Ukraine? And what's at stake for the United States? If we could start with Carl and then go to Anders and then to John.
Well, look, Ukraine is still in an existential struggle. And so the question is, how does this affect the existential struggle that Ukraine is in? It's not, been fighting a two-front war ever since 2014, the Euromaidan. And look, I'm an optimist. I deal with countries like Venezuela, Iran, Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they, the guy who got 63% lost the election. So, looking at Ukraine in that context, I think, frankly, that this was a real step forward for Ukraine. All the reports we got was that this was a really clean vote. Everybody had a chance to express their point of view. It was over almost 100,000 domestic observers and 139 NGOs and 14 international NGOs. This was an amazingly observed process. And with, problems here and there, it was a fair process. And it leads to a legitimate result. And now we're going to have a second round, which will even lead to a more legitimate result, because somebody who wins will have a majority, not a minority of the vote. And I think that's terrific. And the way it moved forward was terrific. So with all the problems, and I know that there are problems, of oligarchs, the fact that there were no real Euromaidan people in the top ranks of the vote, still, I think it was an enormous step forward. I don't think Putin can be very happy. And then, the critical issue is on the international front. And there, I'm also, I realize that, look, Zelensky is going to have a lot of trouble getting anything done domestically, because he doesn't really have a base in the parliament, and the parliament is where, a lot, and that's another issue, the parliamentary election is coming up. And he really doesn't have experience or real advisors on the international front. But he has pledged himself, to wanting to be part of Europe. The very fact of his, getting votes from all over the country means that he's probably brought a lot of Ukrainians into the consensus about joining Europe and NATO that weren't there before. And hopefully he'll have the good sense, and this is something he'll have to do very quickly, to bring around him some very sober-minded national security advisors who can, because he's going to be dealing with Putin, and Putin is going to be testing him, and he's going to have to be ready for that. So that's the big issue, to come. But fundamentally, I think, this was a major step forward for Ukraine, and I'm actually very pleased with what's happened.
Great, thank you, Carl. Anders?
Yeah, let me follow up on two themes that Carl brought out. One is that these were the freest, fairest, nicest, most competitive elections that Ukraine has had. And this is, of course, a major Western interest. And I would also emphasize here, the right-wing nationalist candidate got only 1.6% of the vote. So Ukraine is today in Europe almost unique in not having a right-wing extremist problem. That's worth thinking of. And let me elaborate it a bit more. Ukraine has, for the last 2.5 years, a openly Jewish prime minister who's proud of being Jewish, and Zelensky is Jewish also. Could any other European country have a Jewish prime minister and a Jewish president? Which means that Ukraine today stands out as far more tolerant than almost anybody else. And I think that's worth thinking about. And what were these elections about? You can say that they were about two things: nation or corruption. So on nation, we have two groups. One is Poroshenko, who ran on army, faith, and language, and he got 16% on that. And who voted for Poroshenko? Kiev and 3 West Ukrainian, or 2 West Ukrainian oblasts. And on the other side of nation, we have Yuri Boyko, who ran on what he called peace and development, but really was Russia. And he got 11.5%. So what this says is that Ukrainian voted against corruption. Who ran against corruption? Most of all Zelensky, also Tymoshenko, also Khrytsenko, and together they got 50% of the vote. while the national team got 27% of the vote. So Ukrainians were sufficiently confident that they focused on improving their own country rather than being worried about the nation. So the point we should get here is that the Ukrainians are much more confident in themselves than we think, and that they are now prepared to deal with a big problem, and that is corruption.
Great, thank you, Anders. John, would you hop in? And then we're going to go to Natalia.
Well, again, first, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and assume anything about round two on the basis of round one. But I agree that Zelensky's strong showing is an indication of great unhappiness with what's going on domestically in Ukraine. I think by and large, Poroshenko gets high marks, including from the Ukrainian people, as a war leader. But this comes back to the point, the important point that Anders just made, that there's enough self-confidence in the Ukrainian electorate, even while they're fighting a war against the world's second greatest military power, they're focusing as well on domestic concerns.
Great. Natalia, you are a great expert on Russian foreign policy, so I'd like to, everyone here is dying to ask you, what's at stake for Russia? What does Russia want? Did it have a favorite candidate in the election?
Sure. First of all, I think I agree with the point that the fact that Ukraine had a democratic election indicates that Russia hasn't achieved its core objectives in Ukraine, which is reorienting Ukraine back politically to Russia's orbit, and not just orbit, but also model of governance. That said, I think we need to look at a question of whether Russia has improved its positions within this election. Russia has taken a much longer look and longer take at this round of both presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine. And from their perspective, they have supported negative ratings of Petro Poroshenko, who was one of their least preferred outcomes, and he will be winning with either winning with a low margin or not winning at all. Secondly, we assess that the higher percentage of support for the populists like Poroshenko and like Zelensky still benefit in Russia, as fundamentally it moves Ukraine further from the reform path. And thirdly, Russia was able to secure a higher level of support for the Russia-leaning parties such as Vilko and Boyka collectively. They're also playing the longer game in the sense that they're prioritizing parliamentary elections as much as they're prioritizing the presidential elections, because fundamentally it's the Ukrainian parliament which can decide whether to adopt or block certain pro-Western, pro-EU laws. I think the key point here is that for Russia, there is a longer-term stake here in terms of its ability to make progress for the next round of elections and whether it's able to reorient Ukraine politically in the long term. But in the short term, it has a lot more practical inquiries, such as they need to be able to negotiate the reopening of the fresh water supply to Crimea, which is a major problem for them, as well as certain types of the energy deals. We assess that they might be viewing an opportunity with the more populist candidates to make deals with them down the road.
Great, thank you. John, did you want to talk about what Russia wants out of this outcome?
Well, I think that they really were hoping that Tymoshenko would win. Obviously, that was not officially stated, but I think that they thought that she'd be easier on them because of the relationship she had with Putin. Though I thought they would have been sorely disappointed because Tymoshenko was very much her own person, and she would not in any way be amenable to Putin's interests. And of course, I just came from appearing on the Russian TV program, The Great Game, and they were talking about how there were massive violations. And they were not happy when I said that Ukraine had a real election, which is something that's unknown in Russia. But the big point is, if Poroshenko loses, Putin will declare victory because he said he's unacceptable. And if Zelensky wins, he will certainly be tested. But I think that, again, the people of Ukraine are not going to let the Kremlin dictate what Ukraine does.
Great, thank you. Anders, I'd like to ask you, so it looks like Tymoshenko is going to come in third place. What happened? What did she do wrong? Some people say that she started too early and she crested too hard and too fast. She spent too much money at the beginning. What do you think she did wrong looking back on her campaign?
Well, she had chosen law and order platform. Her big issue was a new constitution for Ukraine, which is really quite original to run on a new constitution. Very sensible in the case of Ukraine. But then also she had essentially adopted her program in mid-June last year, and not much happened after that. So I think that the point you made here, that she peaked too early, is very clear. And then Zelensky seemed more credible with his television series on the anti-corruption platform, and not being part of the old establishment. You can say that Tymoshenko's standard slogan in this election was Novi Kurs, a new course. I mean, it's not much better than stronger together, if you allow me. And when I was in Kiev a month ago, when I drove to the airport, I saw at least 20 billboards, probably more, and all had the same Tymoshenko's bill and new course, the changes we are all waiting for. I mean, does that get you excited? It doesn't. So she sort of didn't have anything extra in the election. If you can say that while she has a populist reputation, she might have tried to deny it too much this time, that she would have been better off if she had done some populist push. But of course, Zelensky sort of stole her real platform. Her other slogan, which she didn't put on billboards, was the Poroshenko mafia. And of course, Zelensky seemed much more credible in running against corruption and against Poroshenko than she did.
Except that he has, there's a giant elephant in the room. There's the Kolomoisky elephant. So let's ask our panelists this. What does this say about Ukraine, the health of Ukraine's democracy, when we have our second round is going to be between Zelensky, who has Kolomoisky behind him, and Poroshenko, who's an oligarch. What do you think that says about the quality of Ukraine's democracy? Carl, would you like to start?
There's no evidence that Kolomoisky controls Zelensky. He appeared on his programs and so forth, but he's not an oligarch-controlled candidate. He really did reach the people, and he, unlike Tymoshenko, he had a message that they wanted, and it wasn't the message that was shaped by Kolomoisky. He didn't talk about that, and there are no promises there. He's a candidate really. He did out populist Tymoshenko, and she also couldn't appeal in a way, to the issue of nationalism, because Poroshenko had stolen her agenda on that too. So she was weak. I'm not worried about that really. I think that Ukraine has a lot of problems. It's a country that is still, suffers from the legacy of being, of Homo Sovieticus and so forth. But what this represents, it's the critical issue for Ukraine, is it can move from the past to the future. And it was not going to do that, frankly, with Poroshenko or Tymoshenko. And I realize the election is not over yet, John. I'm aware of that. Although it looks like it's going in a direction that which Zelensky will probably win, and he has a lot of young people. He has people all over the country. He has poorer voters, the kind of voters that might otherwise have gone for Tymoshenko, and I think that's all positive. I know you're concerned, Melinda, but this is in my view, something very hopeful.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in? John, do you want to jump in?
I would say, that first of all, we should be concerned about the Kolomoisky connection. I think it's reasonable to assume that connection is stronger than this, for example, the Daniluk-Zelensky connection.
For sure.
That doesn't mean that he's controlled by Kolomoisky. We simply don't know. But the point is that He was freely chosen by the Ukrainian people, precisely because the issues he raised. And in that sense, he's very much a legitimate candidate. And if he does win in the second round, he will either maintain a certain distance from Kolomoisky, or he will pay a political price.
Okay. So is it right to understand this panel, I'd like to know, is it right to understand this first round as a protest vote? That people wanted to get their steam out, they're frustrated with the regime, and things might change in the second round? Or was it a referendum on Poroshenko? What do you guys think? Anders, do you want to take that?
Well, Poroshenko is in the view of many Ukrainians identified with corruption and oligarchy, and this is what people are voting against. I would see it, Poroshenko very carefully avoided anything that had to do with rule of law and the economy, and instead pushed nationalist themes in his elections. And Zelensky essentially did the opposite. He focused on corruption. And with Ivaras Abramovichus and Alexander Daniluk standing by him, he also got quite a lot of reassurance among ordinary businessmen. So I think that's quite positive. I should also emphasize what Carl touched upon. Zelensky's voters are young. These are the people who are below 40. When I was in Kiev last time, several people told me, we have had it. We want to get rid of this oligarchic system, and we don't think that our old politicians can do it. We need to have outsiders, people who have not been contaminated by the systems. And again, watching Servants of the People, you see wonderfully how the oligarchs run the show. 5 new ministers come in. What do? We buy them all with a deputy head of SBU, the security services. How much do they cost? $10 million each. Okay, the 3 big oligarchs get together and say, this crowd was cheaper than the former one.
Oh my God. I'm going to take off my moderator hat for a minute because I've spent a lot of time following the reformers and talking to Daniluk and Ivers as well. And when you talk to Daniluk, he does say it's a gamble. And he says this is a risk management strategy. We don't know everything about Zelensky. And we'll see what happens. We'll see, the voters are going to want more information. He's going to have to get more specific in the next 3 weeks. So we'll see how it turns out. Natalia, I'd like to come back to you. There was one theory that the Russians were okay with the top 3 candidates. They were fine with Poroshenko, they're fine with Zelensky, they're fine with Tymoshenko. Of course, they say they don't want Poroshenko, they would prefer Zelensky or Tymoshenko. But the basic idea is they know how to work with all of them. What do you make of that argument?
Sure. I think following up on some of the excellent points made before, I think Zelensky, for him, provides an opportunity for Russia as he's one of the more shapeable candidates. Therefore, they see an opportunity with Zelensky as well as they've seen an opportunity with Tymoshenko. I think their preference, as we assessed it, was Poroshenko not being reelected, as he would have probably continued the same course within the same range of pro-West, but with very slow reform progress. And Russians might have had a lot of their leverage that they had on Poroshenko used up in their first term. I think, but going back to the initial point, I think what's key to them is the overall configuration of the new political balance after both presidential and parliamentary election, and whether they can get a higher number of parliamentaries that are amenable to Russia's interests in the long term.
Great. John, did you want to jump in? Oh, I'm sorry, Carl, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that the Russians don't appear to have had a candidate in this election. What they really wanted is the same thing they do in the United States. They want to undermine confidence in the process. They want to undermine national unity. And let's face it, they lost. They lost big because it was a legitimate process. People accept the process. They were not alienated from the process. There is probably now more unity and more hope in the future than there was before the election. So I think the Russians lost. They can always manage something, but I think they're in a much weaker position. And, look, Putin's got his own problems. He's got a declining economy. He's, still suffering, from the sanctions. he's got his own troubles. I mean, that could be a problem, because sometimes when a guy like Putin gets into trouble, he may want to play the nationalist card and attack Ukraine. That's always a danger. But, you know, as far as also your question about, is this a referendum on Poroshenko? You know, yes, it was a rejection of the corruption and so forth. But I think, you know, in assuming that he doesn't win, you know, I think when people look back on the 5-year period of his rule, it'll be more positive than negative. In other words, there were some reforms that were not unimportant in decentralization and in other cases. You know, he did have a very competent national security policy. And, you know, at a time when you have countries like Hungary, where Viktor Orban uses a democratic election victory to try to consolidate power and build an authoritarian state, Poroshenko didn't do that. You know, that's important. And I think we have to keep this whole thing in perspective. And I think people will look back and feel that he took the country a step forward.
John, could you explain the differences between Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Poroshenko on foreign policy? Are there major differences?
One, they share a pro-Western orientation. NATO membership, EU membership are their objectives. But it is true that Zelensky has spoken about trying to deal with the problem of Donbass via negotiations with Moscow, and that seems naive. A resolution to Kremlin aggression in Donbass will eventually involve negotiations. But Moscow has tried via its military superiority to force negotiations which will achieve their objectives. So the first and most important thing for any president of Ukraine is to rally and maintain a staunch defense of Ukraine militarily in Donbass. Poroshenko knows that in his bones. He's been dealing with this for 5 years. Zelensky has not had that problem. Hopefully he would come to that conclusion. And if he does, then the differences between the two will be negligible. But we don't know that yet.
Do you think that public opinion constrains the future president, though? That even if Zelensky talks about a NATO referendum, you know, that may be a campaign promise to appeal to the South and the East?
A NATO referendum, I suspect, will fall by the side if Zelensky wins. But NATO referendum is a secondary, even a tertiary issue. The issue, the national security issue, is this war that Moscow is conducting in Donbass.
Sure.
And it's the first priority of any president of Ukraine to marshal resources to make sure that the Kremlin does not succeed.
So when you met with Zelensky, did he seem to understand that that's the priority?
He clearly understood that Moscow was waging war in Donbass, and he understood that he would be tested. So to me, those were positives.
Okay. So let's talk about the second round. The second round is on April 21st. What do you expect from the second round? Anders, if you could, you've done some of the math on the back of a napkin. Could you tell us how you expect, so how do you expect Tymoshenko's voters to vote in round two, Gritsenko's voters, Boyko's voters? What should we expect?
Yeah, say that there are two different ways of looking upon it, messages and horse trading with other defeated candidates. So I would presume that Tymoshenko and Gritsenko, that have run against Poroshenko most of all, that they will have to join with Zelensky more or less. Boyko and Vilkur, here it's difficult to say, the two eastern candidates with 15% altogether. Boyko has business relations with Poroshenko, but he's also Eastern. Can his electorate vote for Poroshenko, who is running on a Western nationalist position? Hardly. So I doubt that Boyko can really direct his voters. Smishko, the former head of SBU, who got 6%, I would guess that his voters essentially go to Poroshenko, because this is, so to say, the decent establishment. Then we have Yashko of a radical party with 5% of the vote. I think that this is easily traded. And when it comes to trade, Poroshenko, with his political skills, is of course much better at trading jobs and positions than Zelensky, who will probably avoid getting into that game because it would look bad to his voters. To Poroshenko's voters, it would show that he's competent. So I would guess that Lyashko would try to get his voters to Poroshenko. And what this comes out as, according to the opinion polls, is Zelensky wins by almost 2/3 of the votes, with an advantage of 30-35%. And that's what all of the opinion polls have said before the first round. And I would guess that not much happens there. With regard to message, I think that Poroshenko already yesterday said it very clearly. He will run on two things: that Zelensky is unreliable when it comes to national security, that he will somewhat what John has suggested could be a danger, that he could fall to Putin's tricks, and of course that Zelensky is Kolomoisky's puppet. That's the term that Poroshenko uses, while Zelensky probably would pick up a number of corruption scandals. I mean, the election campaign has really been corruption scandals that have not come directly from the candidates, but from other sources. So I think that we will see lots of juicy corruption scandals in the next 3 weeks.
Okay, so don't take your eyes off of Ukraine. John, we were talking earlier, though. So obviously, Zelensky has a strong lead. Poroshenko still has very strong numbers. He's a strong campaigner. He's a strong debater. What other factors are you looking at and considering? Do you think that Zelensky's numbers will be as high as Anders is predicting?
I'll be modest and say I just simply don't know. Clearly, Zelensky is the guy to beat, given what all the numbers show. But he's going to face unparalleled scrutiny in the next 3 weeks. There's going to be a debate, and Poroshenko will have an opportunity to try and trip him up.
Sure.
If he does, that could lead to serious numbers consequences for Zelensky. So that's the first point. Second point, I'm not as clear as Anders as to how the other parties and their voters are going to play out. I would expect Yulia Tymoshenko, who remains the most resourceful politician in Ukraine, to try and reach an understanding of one or both of the candidates. If she does, that may have an impact on where her voters go. So it may not be as simple as the average Batkivshina voter saying, well, okay, I went for her in the first round, I'll choose him in the second round, whoever that him is. And I don't know how the national security voters go, given the question marks around Zelensky. So I suspect that the second round will be a tighter race than the first, but still I'm just not sure. This is a true wild card election.
Okay, Natalia, would you like to hop in there?
Sure, I think I will provide perspective from the Russian side
Sure, please.
on what we could expect and watch out for. I think they will maintain more of observational status. However, the rhetoric that we're already seeing coming out of Russia today, at least from Kremlin media, is that Ukraine is finally getting rid of its post-Maidan coup government and potentially electing a new wave of government. So there is a cautious optimism in the media. I think it would be really important to watch out for any attempts to further either undermine Poroshenko's rating prior to the next round. We also, I think, should really pay attention to nominations of Zelensky's team. Going back to the point, I think the risk, Zelensky is a wild card who provides opportunities but also major risk factors, and he is the most shapeable candidate for the set of reasons. First of all, because he does not have a team and he does not have yet a fully formed, I think, policy positions. So whoever will be shaping that space will be critical, I think, not just for the second round, but actually for what comes after.
Great, and that's a great segue. So this is a big year for Ukraine because it has 2 rounds of presidential elections and then parliamentary elections in October. and a lot of people have argued that the parliamentary elections are actually more important than the presidential, and stop obsessing about the presidential elections. Carl, I've talked to civil society a lot, and you're a civil society guy who has his finger on the pulse of civil society, and they're quite worried. They think that the next parliament is going to be fragmented, not very reform-minded, and they don't see a lot of protection in the next parliament. What sources of leverage does the West have to continue to push Ukraine to make the right reform choices?
I agree with, I share their concerns. I think that you have much greater likelihood of people in the parliament, some of them being pro-Russian, some of them being populist, and so forth. And there will be much more fragmentation, and people will go their own way. We don't know who the prime minister will be, who is obviously going to play a big role in this. You have these, I guess half the districts are single mandate, and Russian money can be very influential in those districts. And so, and then that's where the role of people like Boyko and possibly Vukul and others will come in. I mean, they will have people in the parliament, and Zelensky doesn't have anything in the parliament. It's going to be very difficult for him. I guess we'll see what he's able to put forward by the time October comes around. And you do get a bump if you win the presidential election.
For sure.
For the parliament. But right now you have to assume that he's not going to have a strong hand in the parliament. And that he will need the West and the IMF and also the continuingly and almost surprisingly united Transatlantic Alliance on sanctions and so forth to begin to really try to exercise some pressure on the parliament. But I think we can expect that it's going to be a difficult and very messy situation. You also have the local elections coming up a year later, and there it's a lot better. And the process of democratization in Ukraine is going to take place over years and years. And the critical thing now is, this is what a lot of these groups do, are building support at the grassroots level. And you can get civil society pressure coming from the grassroots on the parliament. That will probably be the most important source of pressure. But it's going to be a struggle, and I expect, I'm much more worried about the parliamentary elections than about the presidential.
Okay, we'll definitely reconvene for another panel in the fall. John, can you say more about the points of leverage that the West has in continuing to keep Ukraine on a reform path, or encouraging Ukraine on a reform path?
The dynamic of reform in Ukraine, and there has been serious reform, which has not been given enough attention. The dynamic of reform in Ukraine has been an alliance among the young reformers in the Rada, the reform ministers like Natalie Uresko and Danylyuk, and the head of Naftahaz Kabalyev, and international actors, the IMF, the EBRD, the United States, and the EU. And in effect, that international component has been very important, because the IMF has said, if you want the following $1 or $2 or $3 billion of financial aid, you have to enact the following reform legislation. And this has persuaded the president, the prime ministers, often to make the right decisions. So this has been a main fulcrum of reform in Ukraine. It will continue to be a fulcrum of reform in Ukraine. And that's why I was confident even before yesterday that no matter who won, Ukraine would continue to move in the right direction, albeit not as fast, perhaps, as we and certainly the young reformers in Ukraine would like.
Great. Anders, someone mentioned the next prime minister, and there's talk that Yulia Tymoshenko might be the next prime minister. Is that crazy talk, or is there a reason to believe that could happen?
I saw that the Zelensky campaign responded to that point today and said that we are in no position to discuss a prime minister today, because that will be determined by the next parliament that will be elected on the 27th of October. We will have a party represented in that parliament, and after those elections, we are ready to discuss who will be the prime minister. What is needed is a government that will have a majority in the parliament. Realistically, that will be at least 3 parties, and therefore that will provide quite a lot of stability, I would argue, because it will represent different interests, and the hope then is that many of the current corrupt parliamentarians disappear, and since they are exposed by the excellent civil society and the free media in Ukraine, we can expect that many of them will be so discredited that they can't stay on in parliament. So I would expect the quality of the parliament to improve with the next elections, and we can't know anything about who will be prime minister until after the 27th of October.
Okay, you heard it here first. Anders Åslund is the only person I know who predicts that the next parliament will actually be an optimistic thing. So we're going to hold you to that prediction. Before I open it up to Q&A, I'd like to ask our 2 middle panelists. There's a sense of Ukraine fatigue. It depends on where you are in Europe. I'm told in Estonia there's no such thing as Ukraine fatigue. I'm told in Germany there's deep Ukraine fatigue. What can we do, what can the West do to keep people interested in Ukraine? Like Carl said, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. This is going to take a long time. What's your perception of things that the West can do to keep people interested?
Well, first of all, you know, we're in a tough time for democracy in the world, you know, all over. Resurgent authoritarianism, backsliding democracies, crisis of populism and nationalism in the established democracies and so forth. And Ukraine is a positive story. I mean, I believe it's a positive story. That's very, very important at this time. And I think, you know, we have to underline that. The other thing is, I was actually in Kiev at this Thinking Together conference that Tim Snyder and Leon Wieseltier pulled together right after the Euromaidan in May, you know, 2014. And I was there when Carl Bildt said, Ukraine is the epicenter of the global struggle for democracy. You know, he said that, you know, and I've used it a few times. It still is in a way. In other words, China is much, much more important on a global level now than it was then, and also more important than Russia is because it has much more global influence today. But still, Ukraine is very central to what happens, certainly in the transatlantic sphere and in Europe. And the fact that it's moving in the right direction and is, in my view, a very significant defeat for Putin and everything that he represents and wants is a very positive message. You know, Brzezinski used to say that if Russia loses Ukraine, it ceases to be a Putin country, you know, a kind of great Russian chauvinist country. It has the potential to become a normal country. Think of that for a moment. And think about the significance of what it means if Ukraine actually succeeds. And that, you know, it was 5 years ago that Bildt said that. And here we are today. And, you know, I think there's been, frankly, 5 years of progress. Limited. You know, obviously Ukraine is not a corruption-free country, and there's still a war going on in the Donbass. Crimea has been annexed, and it's still not back. But still, it's a positive message, and if Ukraine can succeed and keep on this positive path, it really represents something hopeful for the future of Europe, and even, frankly, as hard as it is to say this, for the future of Russia.
Great. Natalia, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think to just build on, I think West has actually quite a bit at stake in Ukraine scenario. Right now, Ukraine is on the Western course. That's not a given. I think if we look further and if Russia is able to reorient Ukraine back to its orbit, there is quite a bit at stake for the West, including the European security, but also the implications for the rule-based international order. And if Russia manages to reorient Ukraine back into its orbit with time, a lot of things that Russia has done in Ukraine will become an international norm and will have international ripple effect. I think in terms of what U.S. can do, we can never underestimate the importance of U.S. sustained engagement. Even just keeping focus means a lot. It means a lot for European engagement in the issue. And right now, Ukraine's progress actually depends on the the body of individuals, reformers within executive, legislative branch, together with the Western partners, as Ambassador mentioned, making sure that they remain in government, which is also not given, is actually what the most important thing that I think the West can do.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, now it's your turn. Do you have any questions? Yes, good. Okay, so before I call on you, please have your name and your affiliation ready. And we do not do statements here, and I'm going to cut you off if you give a grand floor statement. This is not a parliamentary body, so please use a question mark. Viola, right here, please. And she's a journalist, so she'll ask a question.
Viola Ganger, Washington editor for Just Security, which is an online forum at New York University Law School and National Security Law and Policy. I have two questions. One is the relationship between Zelensky and Kolomoisky. A lot of people are saying we don't know whether Zelensky is indeed controlled by Kolomoisky. Is there any way to detect that between now and April 21st that nobody else has thought of yet, or signs to look for? And the second question, perhaps for Natalia, but others as well, how is Russia positioned in the next 6 months militarily in terms of possible further movements against Ukraine?
So on the Zelensky question, investigative journalists have noticed that I believe that Kolomoisky's bodyguard was also working for Zelensky, and there was also another vehicle that was registered that was carrying Zelensky or his crew around that actually belonged to Kolomoisky. So beyond I believe they've been business partners for 7 years. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. They've been business partners for a long time. Kolomoisky's shows have been on 1+1 for a long time. But investigative journalists are looking for those links. Now, if you ask them about it, Kolomoisky has said publicly that Zelensky is more my puppet than I am. No, he says that the direction goes in the opposite direction. That he knows him, but he's not my puppet. He's more independent than you think. He told the BBC, though, he said that we need more we need more Zelenskys. So it's really inconclusive.
I could take the question.
Go ahead.
On the military. I think it's very important to know that Russia's war against Ukraine continues, and Russia is actually enhancing and enforcing its military positions around Ukraine. So we're seeing a couple of places where they reinforce their positions. First of all, it's in Crimea, and they've just conducted major military exercise last week. They've brought in additional S-400 air defense system. We're seeing them ramping up their deployments also on the border with Kherson, which they've done in the end of 2018. Additionally, they continue their military pressure in the Strait, in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. We have seen them reinforce their positions from the northwest side of Ukraine as well. I think the bottom line is that they're waiting. I think they will wait and see the outcome of the election and whether they will assess they have a chance of negotiating with the next the next president. However, they are positioned to escalate from one or more points should they choose to. And I think the key point is that they maintain the ability to turn conflict on and off at the time of their choosing. We assess that Kherson region is probably more vulnerable from that perspective, precisely because of their need and requirement to renew the freshwater supply to Crimea, at least within the next 12 months. They will try probably to solve it politically if they can. However, military has to remain an option for them on the table.
Great. Did anyone else want to jump in? No, I had to, Viola, I didn't want to botch it. Kolomoisky said, I am more his puppet than he is mine. So, anyone, I think Mikola behind her had a question. Hold on, wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm Mikola Vorobyev, Ukrainian journalist currently with Voice of America. Thanks very much for your brilliant insights. So, well, I have many statements, but I will ask a question actually, so it was agreed on. The question is, so we're still not sure if it's like for 100% that Tymoshenko isn't getting to the second round, because like still 9% of votes. I mean, we are waiting for the results. But in any way, the question is about the future of Poroshenko if he loses the elections. because all the candidates, they are strong on corruption, they are strong on Poroshenko schemes also, which was discovered by the journalists. So what do you think? Will Poroshenko be persecuted if he loses the elections? And what's his political future if it's so? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's a question for Anders or John. Anders loves to take these ones. Anders, you go first. No, John?
John.
Look, I think these are very provocative questions. I think that if
Can you tell he was a diplomat?
I think that if Poroshenko does not win round 2, he will probably face a period of political decline. I mean, obviously he's no longer president, but I think he will recede into the political background for a period of time. But he's still a young man, and he's still a very able man, and this would not be the end of his political career by any means. But again, we should not assume he's going to lose this round 2. We'll wait and see how this plays out.
Anders, did you want to say anything provocative?
I don't have any specific thoughts, but you can see that Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who's not in the parliament and has not been prime minister for 3 years, but is still playing an important role in the establishment. The Ukrainian establishment sticks together, and it's very tenable.
That's a good point. The lady right here, please.
Eleanor Bachrach. I served with USAID in Ukraine for 5 years. You emphasized, or it was emphasized, that this past election was probably the most open that Ukraine has had. But I wonder what you think the prognosis is for the runoff, where the stakes are higher and you potentially have one oligarch against another.
Who wants to take that? Carl?
I mean, I would just imagine that the same rules will apply, and there may be some machinations, trade-offs, and this and that. I'm not as confident as you are that votes can be traded off, just because the leaders of a particular candidate makes a deal. But look, actually I don't know whether it will be as observed. I assume the same level of domestic, or almost the same level of domestic observation will take place. This was a very well observed election, and I assume, given the stakes, that it will also be a very well observed election. The Election Commission remains the same. I would imagine it'd be pretty much at the same level.
Go ahead, Anders.
When I saw Yulia Tymoshenko in December, she said that she thought that these elections would be the dirtiest ever in Ukraine. When I saw her 1.5 months ago, she said that things are much better than we had expected, and that it was completely contrary to her prior expectation. That on the contrary, they had no particular problem with the authorities interfering in the campaigning. And my suspicion is that everybody will talk about now there will be a lot of dirt. In fact, Ukraine has quite balanced institutions in this regard, so that it's not so dangerous. So I have the same expectation as Carl, that it will not be as bad as being expected. But on the contrary, once again, I think that we will be positively impressed.
Hold on a second, Anders, but isn't that because of the role of Avakov and the deal he cut with Tymoshenko? That this round of elections was so smooth? And what do you think Avakov's role is going to be in the next round?
The same as now. Avakov is not particularly in favor of Tymoshenko, but he's against Poroshenko. So this is the balance we have within the government. Minister of Interior Arseniy Avakov controls the national police. He had ordered out 60,000 policemen to watch all the 25 ballot stations, polling stations, to make sure that everything went well. Of course, he will do the same next time around. I don't think that he has any particular preference for Tymoshenko or Zelensky, but he has a very strong preference against Poroshenko.
Okay, great. Question back here, please.
Hello, Aaron Kennett. I recently returned from my Fulbright in Ukraine. And my question is, I know that you mentioned you didn't really want to talk about the right or the absence of the right in Ukraine, I guess. And one of the questions that I had is, in Zelensky's interviews, when talked about, renaming or language policies or language issues, obviously he mainly issued non-answers. But I was wondering if maybe if Zelensky wins, you'll see kind of a rise of the right because of his language. He mainly speaks Surzhyk or some weird Russian with a couple of phrases of Ukrainian. And I'm wondering if you think maybe with him coming or potentially coming into power, we could see some sort of reaction from the more nationalist elements in Ukrainian politics and in Ukrainian society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John or Anders or Natalia, who wants to take that one?
I think that one of the great bogeymen of analysis on Ukraine over the past 5 years, especially by those who don't know that much about the country or have a vested interest in a less than honest look at Ukraine, has been Ukrainian right-wing nationalism. It's not non-existent. It does exist. But as numerous polls have shown, the incidents, the views of the Ukrainian people are among the most enlightened in terms of relation towards the Jews, as the role of Groisman and Zelensky show, being Jewish is not a barrier to prominence in Ukrainian politics. And we know that the right has not done well in elections in any kind. It doesn't mean it does not exist. It does mean that it is a far smaller factor than some folks have suggested. And so to answer your question now directly, I don't rule out the possibility that such language policies, if they are pursued by Zelensky, might produce a small reaction on the far right of Ukraine, but I don't think it will be politically significant.
Okay, great. Okay, I got a question in the front, please. In the front, please.
Vladislav Rashkavana, IMF. Anders said about the oligarchic model of economy, and I think one of the main arguments for the last 5 years is that this didn't change, and this was vote. So the question is, how do you think it will change in the next 5 years in case the change of the president, and how?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe who will be the oligarchs?
If you look upon how the money is not being made now by the big businessmen, it is one has been price distortions, arbitrage between prices. That's gone. A second has been public procurement. That has been much improved with Prosoro. There are still parts of it, for example, in the military, where Prosoro does not work. But it has greatly been improved. So what we still have, it's price distortions where you have monopolies. For example, fertilizers, part of a gas market, or non-payments. A major part is that if you are really important in Ukraine, you don't pay. This is like the 18th century European aristocracy, that dukes and counts don't pay. They are too important for elementary payments. That's for the small people. As Leona Hemsley said about taxes in New York. So the idea is that you have to get people to pay and you have to open markets. I think that these are the two big things. And in order to do that, you don't need to go after people and put them into prison. I think that is a pretty hopeless undertaking, because these people, they might be forced to pay, but they will not go to prison. The state is too weak for that, frankly, almost everywhere in the world. And therefore open the markets and make sure that the court system functions so that you can actually collect payments And an important part of that is to do away with parliamentary immunity, because now 2/3 of parliamentarians are dollar millionaires who sit in parliament in order to make sure that they have immunity. I should say that I sit on the supervisory board of a Ukrainian bank, and our biggest problem is our 15 biggest clients who are too important to pay.
Great. Go ahead, please.
Alexander Naumov from George Mason University. What grade could you give to Poroshenko to his status as a war president? On the Power Vertical podcast, Brian Whitmore actually compared him to Abraham Lincoln in the sense that in the status of a civil war, he's been successful in preventing the spread of the Russian Spring, so-called, into other Russian-speaking regions. And also Ukrainians, I mean, the economy has gone down, but you could say it's not as bad as it could be for a country at war. And overall, do you think that his character as a commander-in-chief could bring him over the top in the next round?
Great, that's a great question. Okay, let's go down the line. John, you can go first.
All right. One, I think he has been an effective wartime president. And while I understand why some people would laugh when they made the comparison with Abraham Lincoln, I would say that if you study the Civil War, you know that Lincoln was a deeply unpopular president. True. And his re-election was only assured when Sherman took Atlanta in August or September of 1864. And as I think it was Carl mentioned, if Poroshenko loses, he will be remembered more fondly than he's considered right now. And I agree with that, absolutely. And that speaks also to the point of the domestic circumstances of Ukraine. As Anders pointed out, there has been serious progress on reform, including on corruption, by removing important sectors of the economy from corrupt activities, gas sector, government procurement, and so on. Obviously, we're not so happy on the judicial side, the prosecutorial side, but still, there has been serious progress.
Would you like to?
I fully agree, and one more point I would like to make is that Poroshenko's actions definitely contributed to his negative ratings. However, it's important to remember that it has been a continued systematic campaign for 5 years, launched by both Russians as well as all Poroshenko's opponents, focused on undermining his ratings. And I think it's really important to remember that part of his negative rating is actually due to those efforts, and it's important for us to remember because it will repeat itself again, I think, in next rounds of elections as well.
So is that a B+, or is that an A-, or is that a B, flat B?
I think it's a B+.
A B+. John, we need a grade.
Across the board,
yes.
Domestic and foreign, a strong B.
A strong B? Okay, Carl?
I'm an A-.
A-?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think he's underestimated in, what has been accomplished over the last 5 years on the domestic side, in the area of decentralization, in the reform of the banks, and the reform of NAFTA gas, and so forth. I just think that he's underestimated. And then on the international front, he really built a new army. Yep. I wouldn't underestimate the importance. It's not entirely his doing, but you now have, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church being independent of Russia. That hasn't been mentioned, but that's extremely important. Sure. And also he maintained strong relations with the Transatlantic Alliance, which remains united on sanctions. He negotiated an association agreement with the EU. He negotiated a free trade agreement. You've got vis-a-vis travel. In other words, he has been, he's produced a lot of practical results. But Ukraine is changing. It has been changing, obviously this is a continuation of the Euromaidan, even though the Euromaidan people have not done well in this election. It's a continuation of the Euromaidan and the strengthening of civil society. And I think it's an extraordinary story about how this country has recovered under the conditions of being attacked by a foreign country and occupied by a foreign country. And he deserves some credit for that. So I think he'll be remembered very well.
So is that an A-?
Yeah, it's an A-. I don't want to go too far.
Okay. Okay, I think you're going to have a very welcome and warm reception when you go to Kiev next. Anders?
Yeah, let me divide it into four pieces. National security and foreign policy, excellent. Democracy, good. Economy, good. Judicial reform, terrible. Average B.
Oh, what B?
B.
A B. Okay, I'm going to give him a B minus. What you guys said is right, but let's also remember that the economy is barely growing at 3%. Ukraine has become the poorest country in Europe, poorer than Moldova. 2 million Ukrainians are now looking for higher paying jobs in the Czech Republic and Poland, and it doesn't look like things are turning around domestically. There's also been huge harassment of civil society activists. Reform politicians have green hospital gunk thrown at them. This has happened to civil society activists, and the General Prosecutor's Office is not taking these things seriously. There's harassment of free media. There's been a lot of progress, but it's stalled. That's the story. Right after, and John's right to point to a report that says, yes, there was a huge amount of reform, gas reform that saved $6 billion with a B. But the reform momentum really stalled. So I think if you average us together, we're probably maybe a flat B. Maybe, we'll see. Maybe a B plus. Okay, another question, please. Here in
Kitty Wang with NTD TV. My question is, can you talk more about the relation between NATO and Ukraine, and how will this election affect the relation? Will Ukraine join NATO pretty soon?
Okay, I'm going to actually give the microphone to Sandy Vershbaugh, because he's our NATO guy, and give him a chance to answer that. No one knows NATO better than Sandy.
Well, Ukraine has been making pretty good progress in meeting NATO standards and achieving greater interoperability, but it's still several years before, even in the most optimistic scenario, I think NATO is going to be ready to move beyond its current position, which is to repeat the Bucharest formula but not actually deliver. But I think both candidates going into the second round have taken pro-NATO stances. I think I wonder about Zelensky's insistence on a referendum. Is this a way to evade following through if the people only support it at 40 or 45%? Or is this something that is meant to kind of strengthen his bona fides as an advocate of Euro-Atlantic integration? That I think will come out a little bit more clearly in the campaign for the second round. But I think an important thing that he can do is following through on what he said about naming his future foreign minister, defense minister, before the voting takes place, to kind of make clear where he stands definitively on NATO integration. Poroshenko, there's no ambiguity there, and having passed these constitutional amendments, is trying to strengthen his bona fides. Zelensky has argued that those are a diversionary tactic. I think it's an important step to demonstrate broad support of the body politic for NATO integration.
Great.
Ultimately, Ukraine is going to have to deliver by performance, and also finding ways to improve its relationship with Russia. Allies are going to be very wary as long as there's a deadlock in eastern Ukraine.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, you wanted one more question? Yeah. We're going to do it, okay. Can you send it back over? And then, thank you so much.
Even with John very accurate statements, we came to this moment with more or less concept that Zelensky wins the elections. At least this is what the total discussion goes. What should Poroshenko do in the next 3 weeks to change these both perception but also the results? Do you think it's possible?
Is it possible for Poroshenko to win?
I don't think there's any question. Of course it's possible. And I don't think, I've said multiple times on this panel, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Zelensky wins. Poroshenko's strength is, again, he is an experienced international leader, which Zelensky is not. And his second strength is that he is very familiar with issues, which Zelensky is not. And there will be debates where Poroshenko will have the opportunity to make that clear to the Ukrainian people. And then the third point, of course, is that Zelensky's great strength is the appearance that he is the anti-corruption candidate. But the fact that his principal backer is one of Ukraine's most notorious oligarchs is an extraordinary vulnerability. Now, if this becomes a point of focus in the next 3 weeks, that could change attitudes. So I think he has a very clear chance of winning.
Nice input. Okay, this gentleman here.
I'm Scott Morgan. I'm an independent security analyst. My question is regarding the actions. If this is a defeat for Putin, what actions can we look for in other neighbors such as Moldova, Bulgaria, regarding upcoming elections or other things? So if Putin is defeating Ukraine, where will he shift his focus to next?
Well, does the panel agree that Putin's defeated in Ukraine? I think that's an open question. Go ahead, Anders.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that point. What everybody's discussing now in Moscow is the 2024 problem when Putin's term ends. And the idea is that Putin is not going to change the constitution, which he of course could do, and he violates all other articles of the constitution. Why be so coy about the term limit? But it seems to be like that. There's a broad agreement that he can't go for another Medvedev term. Even Medvedev was not cautious enough for Putin. So Putin has to stay on. And the question is how he stays on. And then we have the current dominant idea in Moscow, the Belarusian alternative. There is a Belarusian-Russian union since 1999, from Yeltsin's time, but it has never really come into fruition. So the idea is that Putin will become the president of a Belarusian-Russian union state, and that this will strengthen his domestic standing because he has gathered more Russian lands in this fashion, and this could be an outcome. I don't think that Alexander Lukashenko would accept this in any way. He made a statement about a month ago saying that 98% of the Belarusians would vote against a full union between Russia and Belarus. So I think that this is something that Putin might attempt, and this is the direction we should look at. My conclusion is that the West should try to embrace Belarus much more than we have done so far. But the question now is more to defend Belarus' sovereignty than to stand up for human rights. But here I have David Kramer, who tends to have a different view on this point, so you should ask him afterwards. But this is where we should look.
Did you want to jump in?
I agree and disagree with the premise that Putin won this election. I agree that he lost, Putin lost this election. I agree that he lost in the sense that Ukraine held a democratic election with a true choice. However, Russia has, you can make an argument that Russia has improved their elections positions overall, given the higher percentage of Russia-leaning party that potentially can take seats in the parliament, as well as the rise of the populist candidates in Ukraine. And I think that if we look ahead, Putin's choice of tools might not necessarily be tanks. It will be reopening the market and trying to push the next configuration of political power brokers to slowly, gradually, under the radar, reopen market with Russia and start gaining influence through tying back some of the political power brokers to Russian money. I think if you look at, so the point is here we should not be losing vigilance and considering that Putin has lost this election. In terms of if you look at the broader region, I agree with you on the point of Belarus that the straightforward union and integration and Russia's absorption of that is unlikely. However, Lukashenko might not necessarily have a choice in this matter, and Russia is definitely setting conditions for post-Lukashenko time. And finally, we should be paying attention to Moldova as well, where democratic forces are losing their ground in the parliament, and they have been very effective in terms of pushing back against pro-Russia Dodon parliament.
Great, thank you. We have a question right here, please. Hold on one sec, please. Thank you.
Eri Segura, partner and chief economist of Sigma Blazer, the Blazer Foundation. I do believe that the economic recovery of Ukraine in the next few years will depend on his ability to attract significant amounts of foreign direct investments. Not going to recover on the basis of domestic savings. They will require major inflows of foreign direct investments, principally because of the size of the external debt that they will have to serve over the next 3 years, in between 15 to $20 billion in 3 years. Now, if Zelensky is elected president, would he be able to instill confidence in foreign investors to be able to attract this amount of resources?
Great, thank you very much. Anders, that's a good question for you.
Sure, should be no problem. I mean, we have the IMF as a strong backstop, and I presume that the IMF disbursements will continue because the current standby agreement for this year is with rather light conditionality. The debt service, as you emphasize, is very heavy, and I think that this is in a way good because it forces the Ukrainian government to be highly disciplined. But the fundamental problem in Ukraine, it is that $4 or $5 billion leave the country each year in capital flight because you can't really keep the money in Ukraine because there are no property rights, since the wealthiest people don't have to pay. And that corporate trading is a serious problem. It's the same in all post-Soviet countries, with the exception of Georgia. So this is the problem that has to be resolved, and the medicine is judicial reform. And that's why people are so disappointed with President Poroshenko, that he has not delivered on a credible judicial reform. So as long as foreigners see that 45% of GDP disappears each year in capital flight, they are not going to invest. And FDI now in real terms has been about 1% of GDP each year since the war started in 2014. And I think that the international financial institutions are doing a good job. So I think that this can turn around. And I just happened to look today on the public debt. It is, with current exchange rate, only 58% of GDP. So Ukraine is not that heavily indebted. It has a big debt service, as you emphasize. So therefore, I think that this should be manageable. Ukraine needs longer loans, and that it can take loans on the market. And currently, the yield for Ukrainian Eurobonds are 8-9%, which is far too high because Ukraine does not have a credibility. So I think that this is likely to improve rather than get worse.
Great, Anders. If we could go to Sandy Vershbaugh, and then our last question will be over here. So if you could get the microphone over here. Thank you. Go ahead, Sandy.
Okay. Sandy Vershbaugh, Atlantic Council. I'd like to throw up a speculative scenario for the panel to react to. It's been assumed that going into the first round, the Russian position was anybody but Poroshenko. But now that he's survived and gotten into the second round, does the Russian calculus kind of change by 180 degrees? Because if Zelensky wins, Putin is, I think, arguably worse off. Ukraine will have demonstrated that it's a vibrant democracy, able to run a real election that can have a peaceful change of leaders from Poroshenko to Zelensky. It'll be hard to demonize Zelensky as a kind of crypto-fascist prisoner of the right. The Russian Duma, which is poised to denounce these elections as invalid after the second round, would be much more poorly placed to do that if Zelensky has replaced the evil Poroshenko in round two. So my question is, does Russia suddenly kind of have a need to help Poroshenko in the second round in order to preserve the image of Ukraine as a failed state in the hands of right-wing extremists, as they've been saying for the last 5 years?
Don't underestimate the inventiveness of the Kremlin's imagination when it comes to spinning false narratives. I got a foretaste of that just a few hours ago when I did Bolshaya Igra. I was presented with the following conspiracy theory. Poroshenko was a product of the Obama administration. He is no longer useful to the United States under the Trump administration. Therefore, what we've seen in the outcome thus far from round one, with Zelensky is clearly in the lead, is the Americans in the process of getting rid of this person who's no longer useful for them in favor of someone who's going to be useful to the new Trump administration. However this turns out, if Poroshenko wins round two, and he may well win round two, they'll have some other explanation. So I don't think we could be too worried about this. We just know they'll come up with some nonsense and then try and put it out through all their various means.
Anders?
Yeah, well, I rather by your explanation from the beginning. What would really be embarrassing for Putin is that Ukraine can have free and fair elections. They've had it terrible. And that the incumbent can lose. That must not be the case. So therefore, Putin should be in favor of Poroshenko staying, because that would say that an East Slavic country cannot really have decent elections. So why even should we even try? So, and if you look up on the television channels, there are 3 television channels that are owned by Russian interests. Firtash owns Inter, and it has most of all supported Boyko, who's a business partner of Firtash, but also Poroshenko on number 2. And of the other 2 smaller channels that are owned, we presume, by Medvedchuk, 112 has strongly supported Poroshenko. So there seems, and both Medvedchuk and Firtash have a business together with Poroshenko. Poroshenko has quite substantial connections there. And Yulia Tymoshenko usually emphasizes that unlike some candidates, she does not get dividends from any business activities in Russia. And of course, Poroshenko's big business activity has been his big chocolate factory in Lipetsk, which presumably doesn't work any longer, but I don't really know whether that is the case or not. So the Poroshenko theory would suit my idea quite well.
Okay, we have one last question here, and then it's copyright
Sorry,
time.
Colin.
Oh, I'm
I was
sorry.
going to answer. I just wanted to respond. I just think you're being a little bit too optimistic on the way Russia will view Zelensky and maybe move to Poroshenko, because there's a real opportunity for Russia. There's a real opportunity for Russia in Zelensky, because there's no doubt that his election is going to be followed by a great deal of disillusionment. He's not going to be able to do everything he's promising. It's just inevitable. And Russia will have an opportunity to do what Russia does best, which is to sow discontent, to sow division, to sow cynicism. I'm sure it's preparing for that right now, and as we talked before about the parliamentary elections, that's going to open up more opportunities for division and stalling any kind of progress and so forth. And I think that provides an opportunity for Russia. At the same time, I think it shows Zelensky that he, certainly in the period between now and April 21st and then thereafter, but especially now, he has to send some very clear messages on corruption and on how he will deal with national security. He has to be very, very clear on those things. If he's not, he could enter into the presidency as a much weaker figure than he could otherwise if he could come in with a certain degree of momentum. But look, Russia plays an a steadily negative role on the world stage. I think that my own view is there's a kind of growing Russia fatigue, Putin fatigue, that he's just constantly trying to undermine processes in other countries, even as his own support is going down in his own country. If you compare Putin now with the posture that he adopted 5 years ago, it's a much weaker posture and he hasn't produced on anything that he was promising 5 years ago, and the Russian economy has declined. And I think his position is probably weaker now than it was before, but I don't have any expectation that Russia is going to cease its malign activities in Ukraine or anywhere else in this country.
On that cheery note, it's time for coffee. Thank you so much for joining us. Please help me thank our panelists.
David. When we're going to get the party started. Right? Yes. Wonderful. Good afternoon for those of you who've stuck around with us. My name is Geisha Gonzalez, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center. A couple of reminders, please do silence your phones. I do appreciate ringtones. I think they're super hip still, but it's better not to have it during the discussion. For those of you that are following in the live stream, please use #FutureUkraine. And for those of you in the audience that want to remark anything that gets said, please use that hashtag as well. Of course, you know, we had an excellent panel before. I'd argue that this one is going to be more fun because we'll be able to follow up on some of the questions that came up at the end. Mainly, what is Russia's role in terms of interfering with Ukraine's election and broadly the foreign interference in the election? I'm joined by our excellent panelists who are also the leads of our Ukrainian Election Task Force team. This is a task force that we came up with the support of the Victor Pinchuk Foundation, the Transatlantic Commission for Election Security, and we have partners such as StopFake, Detector Media, and Semantic Visions that also added their voice to this effort. I have Alexei Milnik, who is the co-director for foreign policy at the Razumkov Centre, Jakub Kalensky, who's a senior fellow with us at the Eurasia Center here at the Council, Laura Galante, who is also a senior fellow for the Atlantic Council, both in the Cyber Statecraft Initiative and the Eurasia Center, and David Kramer, who we don't know. he just snuck up here, but who's the Hubble Senior Fellow at the Florida International University, formerly at McCain Institute, and he's been the team lead for this effort. Of course, this election, vastly different than 2014. We came up with this task force thinking about how could we track and expose and explain some of the interference efforts that we could potentially see in the election. David, if you could, just start giving us an overview of, this effort has been going on for almost 4 months. We've been tracking with our leads here and our partners on the ground. What have we seen? What are the first reactions of the election?
Great. Well, Geisha, thanks very much. First, thanks to you and to John and Leona for being such a great team to work with and giving me the privilege to work with Laura and Jakub and Alexei and Maxime and others on this task force. The task force has, I think, been very effective in exposing efforts to interfere in Ukraine's election coming from outside. Now, we have deliberately used the term outside interference and not specifically saying Russian interference, but I'd say 99.9% of the incidents that we have found, not surprisingly, come from Russia and from the Putin regime. There was one case, maybe more than one, that emanated from Hungary, and we can get into that a little later. But the broad goal here is to help Ukraine conduct an election free and fair of outside interference. And I think we have to start from the basic understanding that Russia has interfered in this election from day one. The very fact that Russia occupies part of Ukrainian territory in Crimea and the Donbass has meant that several million Ukrainians have been disenfranchised from this election. So that alone constitutes outside interference coming from the Kremlin. We have seen, and my colleagues will get into more details, efforts in the cyber area and disinformation in the kinetic area as well. And so this is an election that has not been free of outside interference. We also have to remember that going back to 2014, there were the efforts against the Central Election Commission, and Laura can talk more about what we might have seen in this case here. But at the end of the day, it seems that the Russian leadership wanted to create this image that Ukraine was incapable of conducting a free and fair and legitimate election. It has been Mr. Putin's goal to destabilize Ukraine, to have it not succeed, but in fact to fail, because a democratic, successful Ukraine that is moving toward closer relations with the West, in fact, poses a threat to the model that Mr. Putin has put in place in his own country. It wouldn't ordinarily be in Russia's national interest for Ukraine to be destabilized, but it's in Mr. Putin's interest, and that alone poses a threat for Ukraine to conduct this election. Last thing I will say, just to open, the very fact that we didn't know the results of the first round, we don't know who's going to win in the second round, is a positive reflection on Ukraine, that 64% of the population turned out in, for a number of Ukrainians, adverse conditions, speaks enormously of Ukrainians' determination to go and decide their future for themselves, regardless of outside efforts to try to interfere in those efforts. So I think we're talking about an election. The first panel was talking about the possible outcomes in the second round. The fact that we're having this discussion and debate speaks volumes of Ukraine in comparison to so-called elections that are conducted in some of Ukraine's neighbors. So that, I think, is a very reassuring sign that despite the ongoing war that Russia started in Ukraine, despite Russian efforts to interfere in this election, despite challenges that remain internally within Ukraine, Ukrainians remain determined to participate in their democratic process and are determined to decide their future leaders.
And I think we had a great discussion in Brussels where we had Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who mentioned the aim of the Kremlin is not to elect their candidate, but to rather delegitimize the entire electoral process. And part of how you do that is disinformation campaigns. So I'd like to kick it over to Jakub to talk a little bit about our tracking efforts on Kremlin media and what were the persistent narratives across the board.
So we were trying to look at different parts of the information ecosystem. We had an analysis of the big data environment that was done by Semantic Visions, a big data company that monitors the information space. They had all the Russian language information sources that are online. It was more than 24,000 sources, and they were looking at who are the candidates mentioned in the Russian language media. The three most mentioned candidates were actually the first three who ended in the election. So it was Tymoshenko, Poroshenko, and Zelensky. Then we cooperated with Detector Media, a Kiev-based company who were doing the monitoring of the most important Russian TV shows, because the TV shows is basically the basis for the whole disinformation ecosystem. What appears on Sunday night on this talk show that will Monday be online and in print media, and on Wednesday you might read it on Latvian version of Sputnik. And then we had StopFake, quite well known counter disinformation pioneers, again from Kiev, who are monitoring the rest of the online space in Russian media. And we also had Roman Shutov, who did the analysis of the pro-Russian sources in Ukraine, outlets like Ukraine.ru, which are basically, although they are called after Ukraine, they are more pro-Russian. And the conclusion from all these sources was really the biggest effort of the disinformation influence on the Ukrainian elections was to delegitimize the whole process. That was the number one task. So the messages like elections will be rigged, elections will be manipulated, they will be illegitimate. This has been going on since the very beginning of our monitoring in late December, early January. This line has been presented in the media space, then it became an official line to take because Dmitry Medvedev was also saying it. I believe it was in the beginning of March when he said we shouldn't recognize the Ukrainian elections as legitimate. And I think it was just a few days back when Dmitry Zhirinovsky, who is used as kind of clown by the Kremlin, but he always has the most outrageous statements, and then Putin comes out and he can appear like the moderate, reasonable compromise. So again, it was Zhirinovsky actually introducing a law that we shouldn't recognize the Ukrainian elections as legitimate. So you could see that there was really a strategic decision to push this narrative. Do not trust the elections. Do not trust the so-called democracy. It will not be Ukrainians who will pick their president. It will be either Brussels or Washington, which is something that, again, you could see being spread about many European elections. Actually, in this regard, it was quite similar to the elections we have seen in the past 4 or 5 years. The Kremlin always tries to push the message that the result will be rigged, do not trust, because the overall aim is to spread mistrust towards democracy. Do not trust your government, do not trust your mainstream media, do not trust your institutions, and you can spread this message no matter who are the candidates. So we could see this messaging before the Brexit referendum in 2016. I believe you have experienced quite your share of it before the 2016 elections here. Do not trust whatever happens. Before every European elections, you will hear that it's not actually the people who are choosing the winner, it's actually someone else. It's the evil elites, it's Brussels, it's Washington, D.C. I'm not sure who's doing it here in Washington, D.C. It's probably the deep state, right? So, it's not in my hands. So this is what we have seen in the past 4 months. I think we might expect some change before the round 2, because before round 1, I think it was a bit hard for the Kremlin to pick their candidate. I think before round 2 it might be easier, because the race is narrowed down to only 2. They had some very strong statements against Poroshenko, which leaves only one candidate there. But I think the overall aim to delegitimize the whole process and to present Ukraine as an undemocratic country with illegitimate democratic processes, I think this will go on.
So 2 follow-up questions to that. First, do you actually think that they will pick their candidate, or will they continue the same line of narrative, knowing that it's effective? And then second, in terms of the mentions of the different candidates, what were some of the trends that we could observe in terms of how much Kremlin media paid attention to particular candidates across the campaigns?
So the first section, I actually don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think you can still keep promoting that the elections will be rigged, but you can actually also promote that one of the candidates is actually more friend of ours than the other one, and I think this is what might happen. I believe it was the study of done by Ukraine World on the messaging on Kontakte, the Russian version of Facebook, which is banned in Ukraine, but I mean you can go around it using the VPNs and other services. And I think the only candidate they saw positive messaging about was actually Zelensky, the only candidate that received some positive messaging. Apart from that, it was really hate speech against Ukraine as a whole and against Poroshenko in particular. Which is the strategy that they always have. When the Kremlin tried to discredit the Catholic Church, they didn't try to discredit, some bishop in Paris or in Prague. They went for the Pope, and they accused Pius XII of being Hitler's Pope. So again, when you try to discredit Ukraine as a whole country, you will go for the president. They did the same with the U.S. Until the Obama administration. And the second question was?
In terms of, I want to follow up on that really quickly. Knowing what we know about the Ukrainian electorate and some of the results that we've seen, would it not be counterproductive for the Kremlin to actually pick a candidate that they wanted to see win that would be friendly to the Kremlin?
Yes and no. On one hand, they might risk that they would actually help a candidate within Ukraine. On the other hand, part of the propaganda machine, a big part of the propaganda machine, is still directed inwards towards the Russians themselves. So you still need to portray Ukraine as a dangerous country where anti-Russian, Russophobic candidates are winning. So it's not only about Ukrainians being the target audience of this, it's also the Russian audience.
Yeah, and then the second question was, what were the trends of the candidates? Like, who was mentioned most by Kremlin media?
If I remember correctly, it was Poroshenko almost all the time, which is not that surprising given he is still in the office. I think the number 2 for a long time it was actually Tymoshenko, but somewhere in January or maybe February she began to be overtaken by Zelensky. I think the number of mentions actually copied the polls, the opinion polls. So it wasn't hugely surprising. I think it might be more interesting before round 2, because there I think Kremlin might have a more focused strategy. Not only the general, like, let's delegitimize the whole process, but also let's promote one candidate against the other.
Wonderful. And so thinking about the candidates that are mentioned, I want to pull up Alexei to the conversation, thinking about Pesco's statements about having a softer deal with the new president. What have we seen in terms of the discussions there? And then in terms of military engagement and the kinetic piece, what are some of the highlights that we've seen in the last 3 months? And why have we not seen it escalate the closer we've gotten to the election?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Geisha. Let me make a couple of remarks, just explaining what we did and what we, again, trying to do now. Because when we say kinetic, in a classic term, it's about military. But what we actually accepted from the very beginning, that let's not look at just at purely military actions, but any other actions that's connected to violence. And then later on, I personally came to the conclusion that whether we discuss disinformation or cyber, it still fits into kinetic categories, because the current Russian strategy is aimed to weaponize everything from like purely military machine to energy, information, whatever, cyber. For instance, if Ukrainian or the OSCE SMM mission drone jammed or flying over Donbass by electronic warfare, it's the same effect if you shoot with Kalashnikov. So that's why, you know, when but I'll try to focus on, like, as possible on the kinetic. We did notice at least a dozen of actions directly aimed to influence Ukrainian elections. But what we also noticed that we couldn't connect or make a obvious connection between Russian actions and the elections, because most of the actions been done in the broader context in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Secondly, I would say that, for instance, the previous discussion we discussed what was the Russian aim towards Poroshenko. I would probably be very careful to make a final conclusion whether this or that action was aimed to support Poroshenko or against Poroshenko, and that's make our work more interesting, but our life more complicated, unfortunately. And one of the biggest issues, as you said, is the large-scale conflict. And we probably all remember the Kerch Strait incident, which took place in the end of November. And the way it was done, because it is the first time during almost 5 years of war when Russian military, FSB, bodyguard forces used their weapons openly, and they forced the Ukrainian government to react, finally, according to Ukrainian legislation, to declare martial law, which, again, according to the Ukrainian legislation, the elections were to be postponed indefinitely. And thanks to many of the reasons, the martial law was introduced for 1 month only, and it didn't affect the elections. But let me tell you that a week before the end of the martial law, there were some intentions to create another provocation. There were statements made on the level of Minister Lavrov, just to test the ground whether Ukrainian government will react in the same way. It was not probably to help Poroshenko. It was to create some additional tensions and undermine very prospects of the Ukrainian elections. And you mentioned Peskov. Peskov, as probably you know, is a speaker of Mr. Putin. And this morning he reacted or responded to Zelensky's proposal to negotiate with Putin. And he said, like, what we are going to talk about? The Crimea issue, there is no question. Occupation, there is no territory of Ukraine occupied by Russia. And actually it gives you an idea what kind of discussion can be. And when Zelensky says, I'm going to talk to Putin, Russians' perception about negotiations with Putin, you have to listen to Putin and do what Putin says, unless we will do this and that. And yeah, I think I will save some of my strongest arguments for the discussion.
Okay.
Thank you.
I did want to ask, we've been focusing on the Kremlin, but I think this is a good place to start thinking about the other foreign actors that were also involved in Ukraine, particularly around the church issue. Do you want to touch on Hungary at all?
I would probably make some unconventional accusation against some of the actors' involvement in Ukrainian elections. Because there was a statement, very strong statement, made by the ambassadors of the G7 countries in Ukraine. And the statement was about the radical forces. It was actually a letter sent to Minister of Internal Affairs, Avakov. And they pointed out that there is a problem. There are radical forces in Ukraine that are going to interfere in the elections, create violence. And my point is that we shouldn't just say that all kind of interference is negative, because this was an example of interference of G7 countries into Ukrainian elections. And the same, we can mention statements like asking Ukrainian government to become responsible. This is also kind of a positive interference. And you mentioned Hungary. I would probably remind you another case which is also interesting. Perhaps it happened more than 1 year ago. There was an incident, like an attack on a Hungarian cultural center in Uzhhorod. And definitely it was done by the Ukrainian nationalists, because there were some these nationalist signs wrote on the wall, and it definitely was connected to Ukrainian nationalists. But almost 1 year later, it appeared that it was done by 2 Polish citizens against Hungarian Cultural Center, paid by German journalists, and ordered by the his Russian curators. That's how complicated sometimes it can be.
Laura, 2019. Vastly different than 2014 in terms of Ukraine's preparedness for cyber attacks.
Yes.
Despite, we've been tracking, we've been looking, and we have not, luckily, seen any major developments in that space, but we've seen a prepared Ukraine. Can you expand a little bit on that and our findings?
I can, sure. Let me go back for a second and kind of paint the backdrop with which my team approached looking at the cyber elements of what would be happening throughout this election in the last 4 months. Going into 2019, there had been 4 really notable incidents that had happened in Ukraine in cyberspace. The first was 2014, which Geisha refers to, and that's when the Central Election Commission's communication of the voting results in the 2014 election were interfered with from a network standpoint. So there was a cyber attack on the CEC in 2014 that was mitigated before it caused much confusion. However, Russian media picked up on the false results and did play up those false results quite a bit in the early hours of coverage in the 2014 election. So we had that as a first very analogous bar to set against what we might see in 2019. The second was this. In 2015, and then I guess the third in 2016, were in 2 different attacks, but linked closely to a group and a piece of malware and an operation called Black Energy. And in this case, over 200,000 people in 2015 lost power in Ukraine, right? And a similar number in 2016. So this was, and it remains, one of the clearest incidents where we've seen Russian hacking of a power grid with an effect that was successful. And it was everything from taking down the incident call lines to actually operationally turning off the power grid. So that was a huge global incident in 2015 and 2016. Again, a high bar in terms of what had been done in Ukraine cyberspace. And then the fourth incident that we were looking at as we went into the election was the 2017 cyber attack called NotPetya. NotPetya remains the most expensive cyber attack ever, and I think it deserves far more coverage than it got at the time. It is playing out and has turned the insurance world upside down, along with quite a few other sectors. And here's what happened. In 2017, malware that was passed through a frequently used Ukrainian financial, sort of the TurboTax of Ukraine, financial accounting software, MEDoc, spread to numerous multinationals in Ukraine and elsewhere, and took down operations at a variety of companies that had processing plants and operational aspects that were kneecapped because of this malware in 2017. And this happened on Ukrainian Independence Day as well, and it was traced back to and determined by several governments, including the US and the UK, to be the work of the Russian GRU, of the military. And again, the ramifications of that have been litigated, and everything from does this constitute an act of war to how do you ensure and how do you gauge risk if you're a multinational doing business in Ukraine, right? Multifold of implications here. So it was with those 4 incidents that my team looked at 2019 and said, what sort of interference in the cyber domain are we going to see? And yes, Geisha, to put it mildly, we did not see anything that hit the high bars that had been put out before. However, we did have several incidents that I think are noteworthy, especially as we head into the second round here. One was this: the SBU did say that they prevented an attack on the CEC, on the Central Election Commission, in February. We saw several reports of disruption on servers and on the computers of the actual election staff working in the CEC. And I think this detail got lost a little bit over the winter, but one of the interesting pieces that was traced back to some of these election official targeted phishing, targeted emails that were going to compromise these officials' computers, was that the cryptocurrency to buy the data about the election officials was the same cryptocurrency accounts used for previous attacks against Ukraine. So we do have some of the forensic detail and groundwork to see that there was certainly interest by the same group of Russian hackers and in other entities, likely coming from Russian IP space and Ukrainian IP space, to look at the different assets in state critical infrastructure and directly on the CEC's website and infrastructure that point to an interest in doing something in the domain. Now, we didn't see the CEC taken down, or we haven't yet, and we'll see how much of this early activity that happened over the winter and up through March ends up being either reconnaissance and seeds planted for something in the second round, or simply good preparatory action should Russia have wanted to do something bigger if they had thought the outcome or broader political environment hadn't been to their liking. So I'll stop there as sort of a first outline of what we've been seeing over the last 5 months.
Thank you, Laura. Before I start picking your brains on what we ought to expect before the second round or in the lead up to the second round, I'd like to go back to David and start thinking, talk a little bit about, we've seen IRI and NDI statements about the election, talking about this was a free and fair, this was a credible election, a competitive election. But of course, the challenge remains that the Kremlin is still in Ukraine, that is occupying parts of Ukraine, which is limiting the voters and their rights to be able to come out and exercise their democratic rights. What has the government's response been a good response, and what should the administration do ahead of the next round on this?
Well, I think, as Laura was getting at, just because we didn't see the worst fears come true in this first round, we shouldn't become complacent when it deals with the second round or the Rada elections in October. The expectation I think a lot of people have is that the Kremlin thinks it has more leeway to try to influence and affect the Rada elections than perhaps with the presidential. It gets at a point where I think, this may sound paradoxical, Russia's understanding of Ukraine is terrible. You would think that would not be the case given the history and proximity, but it is, because if Putin thought that invading Ukraine would lead to improved relations between Russia and Ukraine, the exact opposite has happened. Putin's done more to unite Ukraine than any Ukrainian leader has over the past 25 years. There's more support for joining NATO, the determination to stay on an EU path. So Putin has actually harmed Russia's national interests through his military aggression against Ukraine. That also suggests they may do things that to us, from a commonsensical point of view, wouldn't come natural to us. And so we should be prepared, as should the Ukrainian security services, the Electoral Commission, and others for things that wouldn't make sense to us, but to them, they seem brilliant. It also is, I think, important to understand that the reason this all matters is because Ukraine is a testing ground. Often what is done in Ukraine by Russia will then be practiced elsewhere. Maybe not exactly, but certainly cyber attacks, disinformation, kinetic a little less so, but Alexei's broader point that this is a hybrid effort across the board is certainly true when it comes to other elections, including the 2016 election here in the United States. In terms of what the Ukrainians have done, I give them a pretty good grade on balance. You can't conduct an election in territory which you don't control. And so while there were provisions for some Ukrainians who wanted to go and vote elsewhere, including Ukrainians living in Russia, Ukraine also couldn't conduct any elections in Russia itself because there were no means by which to ensure the integrity of the election there. I also don't criticize Ukraine for not wanting Russian participants in the OSCE ODIHR observation mission. Not by Ukraine's choice, but by Putin's choice. Ukraine and Russia are at war. And if you're at war, I wouldn't want observers, undoubtedly paid by the Kremlin in one form or another, to observe an election in my country. So I think on balance, the Ukrainian authorities get a good grade for their conduct of this. And to try to bring in as many people as possible. It was Putin who disenfranchised these Ukrainian voters. It wasn't the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev.
Thank you, David. Okay, so now we have 3 weeks before the next round. What are some of the things that we ought to be looking out for? Alexei, I'll start with you. Do we expect any escalation? Are there any signs that this would be one of the tactics that the Kremlin would use, or any foreign actor?
I strongly agree with what David just said, that we are happy that, we are unhappy as experts, but we are happy, especially as Ukrainians, that
yes.
nothing significant happened, especially in Kinetic. But it doesn't mean that nothing was preparing. Like today, I also read the report of our intelligence, military intelligence, that there are some activities going on the front line preparing preparations, because one of the messages translated in information or disinformation, they know that Poroshenko is interested in provocations. And that's actually what Russians maybe try to do again. I mean, not kind of this large-scale war, but increasing violence. And we should watch very carefully. Again, if we, looking not just on presidential election, we should see that Russian interference didn't start at the beginning of the Ukrainian elections, and it's not going to end after the elections. Because I think next 3 weeks will be very critical. But more critical will be the period in between the presidential elections. Because the previous session discussed what is the preferable candidate for Russia. I think the best answer for this question was done by Mr. Venediktov, who is an editor-in-chief of Echo Moskwy, independent Russian media, Gazprom-owned. But I pay credit to his answer. He said, the name of the best Russian candidate or winner of the presidential election in Ukraine is Mr. Chaos. And that's one of the candidates, or it's not a person, but this is Mr. Chaos whom Russia wants to see. And they play equally. I mean, they're not probably, we can't say that they are interested or getting Poroshenko down or supporting Zelensky, because in any case they will play this card or creating chaos. Both of the presidents are going to be weaker than Poroshenko now, because the real support for Poroshenko now, as we see, is something like 15% maybe maximum. Zelensky will be weak because he's not professional. And that's again, that serves Russian interest. And regarding the possibility of the worst case scenario, large-scale aggression, well, I mean, it's hard to predict what Mr. Putin will decide to do. If one day he decides that, it should not be absolutely reasonable, but one day he decides that it will be good for Russian interest, he will just go forward. And the problem is that Russia has resources. It doesn't cost very much for Russia. It has strong will, and Mr. Putin has no restrictions, because the reaction that he actually faced after Azov Sea incident was not something very persuasive.
I mean, we still have sailors that have not come home.
Sailors.
Do we see that Poroshenko may try to make some moves in order to, to ump his position as a war president, to try to get them back?
Well, in our reports, when I was trying, or our team were trying to calculate what kind of instruments we can, make reference as a kinetic. And one of these instruments are prisoners of war, and Ukrainian political prisoners in Russian jails. It's been more than, I think, 15 months, there was no exchange of prisoners between Russia and Ukraine. And the reason is, and by the way, there were negotiations between some of the representatives. And the reason is because Russia treats the prisoners, human beings, as a negotiating tool. And I assume that probably next couple of months, either Mr. Medvedchuk, Putin's friend, or maybe Patriarch Kirill, Russian Patriarch, or another, someone will be afforded this right to release the Ukrainian prisoners. Definitely not Poroshenko.
Jakub, I mean, in terms of resilience and the top experts on disinformation, Ukraine is unmatched across the space. We have StopFake, Detector Media, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, all of these folks that are doing really great work on disinformation and around the election as well. But despite that, we've seen that the Kremlin and other actors have actually started seeking opportunities to use Ukrainians themselves in order to implant some disinformation campaigns, most recently by Russians paying Ukrainians on Facebook to spread some ads. Is this the kind of tactic that we're going to continue seeing in the lead up for the third election, for the second round and then beyond in the parliamentary election? Or are there other tactics that we should be, as a task force, also tracking and observing?
Well, the general line should be that we should be always prepared that the Russians really adapt to the opponent's reaction. It's like when they violate the airspace of Estonia, they are not actually trying to attack Tallinn. They are just willing to see what is their defense. What are they going to do when we really attack? This is actually the same. We've seen the Kremlin adapt so many times. The hack and click strategy that proved to be so effective here in the United States. They tried it in France, 2017 presidential elections. It didn't work at all, probably also because of their misunderstanding of the French media space. The French media actually couldn't use the hacks because they were released some 48 hours before the elections, which is a period of time when the media can't actually use some sensitive information. So they changed the approach for the German elections, which were only a few months later. They had the leaks, they had the hacks. They hacked Bundestag in 2016, and they hacked some major German political parties, and I believe also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They had the hacks. They didn't use them because they saw that actually France got prepared, so maybe we should actually change the approach. I think we will see more of the same. They will always adapt to whatever our defense might be. So if Facebook is actually deleting some pages for inauthentic behavior, yeah, they will try to go around this. So how about hiring real Ukrainians to actually do the job for us? We've seen that some of the users who were very active on Facebook and Twitter migrated to Instagram and 4chan because they are not that well researched platforms. So yeah, I think if there is one constant thing, that is that nothing is actually constant. It really evolves. And the evolution is really based on our reactions to the challenge, which is, as you know, I always like to say that I don't think we should focus on playing defense all the time, repairing our weaknesses, because when we repair one, the aggressor simply moves on to another one. And I think that the only way how to end the aggression is to stop the aggressor.
Speaking of repairing weaknesses, when we think about the cyber environment now, Is there anything, Laura, that worries you ahead of the second round in terms of any cyber threats? Is there anything that you see could potentially be a target ahead of this vote?
Well, I'm in security, so there's always something worrying me.
Yeah.
But look, no, I think over the next 3 weeks, the Ukrainian Cyber Police, the SBU, and then the SSCIP are the three entities, obviously along with the CEC staff, who will be not sleeping well to make sure that their systems are both battle hardened. They're aware of what's happening, right? The biggest fear in a lot of cases here will be there's a vulnerability that's exploited, and you don't know that it's happened until we see leaked email or a compromised server 3 or 4 months from now ahead of the RADA elections or at an opportune moment, right? So certainly the next 3 weeks are going to pose difficult for anyone on the network defense lines, and already have, right? I do think we have kudos to give to the Ukrainian entities who've been involved in this for the last 5 months, but particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. There's quite a bit of funding, effort, and personnel that Ukraine has dedicated into cybersecurity, and also a good bit of US money that has gone into Ukrainian network defense as well. So a lot of people have had their eye on this, and the ability to surface incidents when they are happening and get them out publicly has radically changed from even 2017, again, when the world took quite a while to hear about NotPetya. We've heard about these incidents, even when they're fairly minor, throughout the election. So I think that's a good sign that we're able to get defense info out quickly. We're never going to have ultimate and unassailable security in cyberspace, right? There's going to be incidents. It's how you mitigate them and deal with them. So that's sort of my first point on what we should tactically be seeing over the next 3 weeks. I do think that when we think broadly about how the Kremlin has used network data over the years, I echo much of what Jakub laid out in terms of adaptability as a concept here. Putin is a master of timing. He's no strategic genius, to David's earlier point, but he is a master of timing, and he gets tactics, right? And being able to have information intelligence at your disposal to wield in certain moments is an incredibly effective tool, whether that's to compromise someone's negotiating position or sow chaos or whatever your intended initial goal is, right? And where we've seen this play out more than a handful of times is the GRU or the FSB will hack, especially the email, but other key documents, whether it's the World Anti-Doping Agency athletic data about what prescription drugs different athletes were on during the Olympics in 2016 in Rio, right? Or whether it's John Podesta's email or the DNC email, right? We've seen all of these incidents where collecting intelligence via a network exploitation event, and then using that intelligence and that information, which is legitimate information, it's real emails, using that strategically to change the dialogue, to influence the information sphere, to prepare people for a kinetic battle or the need to defend against a attack or something. Those are the sorts of steps that we would see happening, over the next few months, but even over the early term of a Zelensky presidency, for instance, where you have turnover in government, you have a change of people involved in the security apparatus. That's the perfect time to start exploiting and find some chinks in the armor and get some information that you can wield at the right time.
And Alexei, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, because Laura made an excellent point about why it didn't happen. Because I do agree that we have to credit our Ukrainian government, to our special services, police. Just a couple of examples. For instance, in 2014, the Russian Spring was done mostly by so-called Russian tourists. And the decision, criticized, but very good decision of the Ukrainian government to restrict Russian males aged from 18 to 60 years was absolutely right to do at the beginning of the elections. There was another challenge, it was not in the media, but what I learned from our colleagues from the government, there was some unusual activities, like preparation for this kind of tourists coming from Crimea, Ukrainian passport holders. It was also prevented on a very early stage. And almost on a daily basis, we had reports of Ukrainian police special services discovered it hidden places with weapons and especially with big amounts of explosives. This probably was kind of preparation, and I think was very good or very useful action to prevent. And including like a week before the elections, there was a terrorist plot prevented in the Kharkov underground station. Also was well documented, well investigated, and with the clear Russian connection. So we can say that awareness and preparedness probably will make our reports shorter, which is a good thing.
I'm opening it up for questions from the audience. Any questions? Yeah. Nicola first. And please do introduce yourself. And keep it to a question as well. Melinda is nicer than I am. You can, yeah, we can hear you.
Should I do without mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so really, on the provision of a contributor to Ukraine Alert, I would like to say some remark and then take the question.
No, question.
Question and remark, it's like combined.
Okay, as long as it's
But it's
within
helpful,
okay.
It's helpful, Geisha, really, this is helpful. So what we are discussing here is about the obvious Russian threat, right? So basically Russia 24, RT and other stuff, like those are Russian media outlets which are the clear threat for Ukraine and disinformation and so forth. So the question is, and remark, did you make any research about pro-Russian media outlets in Ukraine? Because there was some accident happened like few weeks ago when it was on, I don't want to name any channels here, but one of Ukrainian pro-Russian channel showed the interview of the former ousted Prime Minister Azarov, pretending that he was in Kyiv studio, and so forth. So which I think is much more dangerous in case of disinformation, because Ukrainians, they see it like as a Ukrainian channel, but they have like pro-Russian like cronies appeared and having like interviews for like an hour or 2 hours. So did you make, task force, did you make any research on this, on pro-Russian media outlets activities in Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Do you want me to?
It wasn't actually part of the ongoing monitoring, to be frank. We were focused mostly on the foreign interference, but we will have a report done again by Detector Media, who will look how the Russian narratives actually translated into the messaging of the Ukrainian media space. So there you will see who were actually the channels who multiplied the Russian messaging within the Ukrainian space. This is what we will have, but we haven't really specifically monitored the Ukrainian media space because we wanted to focus on the foreign interference.
I think that's sufficient.
Can I just
very
shortly? I think it would be useful for our American audience to listen, because Russia today doesn't present any threat in Ukraine. It doesn't present. And I fully agree with you that the main damage can be delivered by your national media. Because our public opinion polls show that Ukrainians hold very low level of trust to the Russian media. And here we have another challenge, because they don't trust Russian media, okay, they don't watch it, but they trust Ukrainian media. And then they have to distinguish what is the Russian message or Ukrainian message. And the same, when I watch here TV in the United States or elsewhere, I see that, okay, Russia today is not as dangerous as it used to be. I mean, probably more dangerous Russian messages translated via national media.
But it was not the subject of the research, right?
It was not, but I mean, that is,
specifically,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. This was actually one of the reasons why we had the monitoring of the Russian TV channels. This is where you have the message like on the first place. Only then it gets later multiplied. So you could say that we were kind of focusing on what the Kremlin is trying to spread about Ukraine, and then it's more like up to the Ukrainians themselves to focus on who is actually multiplying the Russian messaging within Ukraine. You know, maybe we didn't want to be accused of foreign interference ourselves. You know, like saying who is actually the Russian agent in Ukraine.
But can I just add, one of the challenges, and I say this as the most technologically illiterate person in this room, is in this day and age, the source of disinformation often gets lost. And so you could have something that originates on RT or Sputnik or something, and it gets picked up by others, and people forget where it came from. So to some degree, viewership of RT is irrelevant in certain cases if stories then go viral and then infect our own news organizations where they don't bother to verify and vet the information and go back to its original source. It's hard to do because there's so much of it coming at us. But it does seem to me very important to try to do. But as my colleagues mentioned, that looking at Ukrainian media was beyond our mandate. But looking at where stories originate from, as Jakub mentioned with the Detector Media, that's been, I think, an invaluable resource for us.
Here, and then we'll go to you.
Works? My name is Irene Chalupa. I work with a group called StopFake, and I have two questions. One is about the monitoring that you did. What would you say is the percentage of the Russian media space that is filled with Ukrainian disinformation and fake narratives? My other question is for David Kramer. You said how badly Russia gets Ukraine wrong time and time again. One of my favorite examples of how they get it wrong is a kind of a Ukrainian political zombie named Victor Pinchuk, who has tried so many times to get something going, and his heyday was when he was a spokesperson for President Kuchma. I mean, even his latest exercise went nowhere. I think it was Brzezinski that once said that Russia likes two types of neighbors, vassals or enemies. So it clearly likes the second version of Ukraine, I mean the second category for Ukraine. Why do they keep getting it wrong? I mean, they're not stupid people. Putin's not stupid. Why do they keep making these mistakes?
Thank you.
Do you want to no, go ahead.
What percentage of the coverage on Russian media about Ukraine is wrong?
If it's a pie chart, it's 100%. How much of it is dedicated only to Ukraine?
I'm sorry, we really didn't have these numbers. I mean, as I said, the big data analysis we had, they really looked only on the number of mentions of particular candidates. The big data doesn't really tell you whether the information is right or wrong. You know, it's too much of a detail. Yeah, given my previous experience, I used to work in the East Stratcom, and we did this monitoring of various Russian TV shows, etc. I mean, obviously, Ukraine is the target number one for Russian media. Ever since the export of the disinformation started beyond Russian borders, we could say that within Russian borders it has been like at least a decade or maybe longer. But the export, this really began with the war in Ukraine, and I think really like 50% of the lies is about Ukraine, and then it will be about the US, a lot about UK, given the case of Skripal and Salisbury, or a lot will be about WADA, the anti-doping agency. A lot will be about MH17, which is still Ukraine. But yeah, Ukraine is always the number one. And maybe I will steal a little bit of David's question. But you know, sometimes it doesn't have to be only about getting Ukraine wrong. I mean, you are also trying to portray an image of the enemy for the Russians. You have to portray Ukraine as an enemy, so you have to lie about Ukraine. And that might be the part of getting Ukraine wrong. You know, when you lie about someone for so many years, then can you actually understand what it is, what he or she is like really in reality? So that might be part of how they get Ukraine wrong. They kept lying about Ukrainians for so long time that they don't know what is real and what is their fabrication.
Do you want to just mention about the viewership in Ukraine of Russian television?
Oh, we had those numbers. Yeah,
it's very small. It's like 5%. Is that right?
I think it might have been even like 15.
15.
But
okay.
On the other hand, yeah, I mean the viewership or readership of Russian outlets, it doesn't tell us very much. It was, I believe, Detector Media who had the nice study Like 99% of Ukrainians say we do not trust Russian sources. So you could say, well, we have no problem. No. Once you ask about the messages that are being spread by the Russian sources, like was Maidan a Western-backed coup? Suddenly you see that the number of people saying, I trust this piece of disinformation is something between 10 and 20, 30%. So the viewership doesn't really tell you very much. Again, thanks to the mechanism that was already described, the information laundering when domestic sources are spreading disinformation that originated somewhere else.
And the other thing, Alexei, maybe you want to say something about the Razumkov Center's polls have shown that a majority of Ukrainians view Russia's influence in Ukraine very negatively. They view it as significant, but they also view it very negatively. So again, the impact that Moscow seeks to have is not really happening. In addition to what Jakub said, I think you have to look at it from the perspective that Putin is not pursuing his country's national interest. If he were to pursue his own country's national interest, he would want to have stable relations with Ukraine, a Ukraine that is prosperous, that is a gateway to the West, to increase trade east and west. He is pursuing his own corrupt authoritarian interests and playing an incredibly destructive role, not just vis-a-vis Ukraine, but more broadly in Syria, Venezuela, and anywhere else he can around the world. And as a result, I think it distorts the analytical lens through which he looks at Ukraine. And it means that he, instead of pursuing his country's national interests, he's pursuing his own interests, and those interests don't overlap. And so it should be obvious that destabilizing Ukraine, trying to create this conflagration, stirring up these lies, as Jakub said, about threats to Russian language speakers, about NATO coming in, all of this nonsense, it lacks a certain fundamental basis, which is it lacks the truth. And at a certain point, when you lack the truth, it's hard to keep maintaining these lies, but sometimes there are enablers in the West who help perpetuate them.
We have a question back in the blue, and Sandy, if you want to go ahead, yeah.
Sandy Vershbow, Atlantic Council. A question about the religious factor in the first round and what might happen in the second. Obviously, the granting of autocephalous status for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was a big win for Ukraine and for Poroshenko, and a big loss for Putin. Have we seen significant efforts by the Russians to kind of sow chaos using the religious issue to either highlight in their media or even to fabricate or incite incidents between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the old Moscow Patriarchate? And could that be something that we might see more of? Again, not with a view to influencing the outcome, but to create this image of chaos. Ukraine as a failed state, which seems important, as David just explained, for Putin's own agenda, not necessarily in Russia's interest.
Wonderful. And we'll take one more if that's okay. Go ahead.
Zerv, I'm a member of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. A question about Facebook and the other social media platforms. Were they as proactive as they could and should have been? Were they as quickly reactive as they could and should have been?
Okay, they're reactive. So we'll start with the church, Alexei.
That's a very good question. I mean, about another religion being weaponized and used in a hybrid war, in elections. I think there is a very interesting report by the Ukraine Security Service, and I think it's available in English. And there is a huge timetable, like, you know, many details about these priests of Russian or Moscow, Ukrainian churches, Moscow Orthodoxy, let's call them Russian priests. You know, the connections between, you know, incidents and who paid to whom. It is the big scale operation, been carefully prepared and done, fortunately a bit, you know, neutralized by Ukrainian security service, but it's still going on. Again, when you ask me this question, whether there is a destabilization or big number of incidents, I would say it depends which TV you watch, because I also watch Russian TV news from time to time. My wife hates me for that, but anyway, I have to. But when I watch Russian TV, there is almost an incident or a couple of incidents on a daily basis in Ukraine regarding this division of churches. But then, you know, second or third day, you see that this is the same report that you saw last week. And well, there is a problem, but also it's not a religious problem. It's rather a political problem. Ukraine is still a secular state. Ukrainian society is secular society, and you will be surprised that with the number of Ukrainians who are very really religious people, it's a one-digit number. So it's not about religion, but Russians are trying to interfere. And a couple of incidents, not couple, but dozen of incidents that took place in February, I think, mostly in these Russia-friendly regions or vulnerable regions of Ukraine in the south of Ukraine, Zaporizhia. There was same style, like putting fire and making a swastika on the wall. And they didn't actually want to burn the church completely. They needed just 3 minutes of fire, just take pictures. That's another good example and an excellent questions. And the most worrying that Russia, again, supposed to be a secular country, but one of the, not one, but many times Putin himself made the statements. I think it was 10 years of inauguration of Kirill, and he said that Russia will protect not only Russians, Russian speakers, but Russian orthodoxy everywhere in the world. And that's a very worrying.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. On the platforms, do you want me to take?
Actually,
Do you want to?
Just a small addition to this. It actually reminded me of the incident that the Estonian Secret Service capo described, I believe, last year. When the Russians wanted to portray Estonia as a fascist country, they couldn't find a proper fascist in Estonia, so they brought a skinhead from Petersburg and took a picture of him in Estonian landscape because and they finally could prove that Estonia is a fascist country. I think in the information space, what I have seen or what we have seen about the church was again using it to portray Ukrainians as Russophobic, persecution of Russian speakers. That would be the leitmotif that would get repeated. And actually, I see John.
Mike
John,
behind.
Mike's coming there. The other way.
The Kremlin has not done much in this area, certainly less than many of us expected. But perhaps they have not done much because to use an old Marxist phrase, the correlation of forces have moved strongly against them. In Ukraine, unlike in Russia, the churches by law belong to the community in the parish, not to the church itself. And a large majority of Ukrainians are choosing to move to the new Ukrainian church. Scores have moved over the past several months, but interestingly, their priests have stayed behind. We know they've stayed behind because they've been told by the patriarchate in Moscow, you like your salary, you like what you got, you're not leaving. But the point is, there's been very little natural soil for incidents.
And about the platforms, I'm afraid I might disappoint you a little bit. We had a good monitoring of the TV and online space. We didn't really have a dedicated monitoring of the social media because from our experience, they are actually the last in the food chain. The beginning is really on the Russian TV, and then it's about the traditional media. It's much more than about the social media. But yeah, the incidents we have seen, it was what Geisha actually mentioned, the new technique that they are actually using genuine Ukrainian users. You were asking whether they were more reactive or proactive. I would probably need to know how you define that. It seems to me that when they try to be reactive, it is more about the incidents like MH17 or Skripal poisoning or bombing in Syria, when they really try to change the perception of something that already has happened, and the situation is kind of unfavorable for Russia. So they spread the multitude of messages, usually contradictory, so that an average media consumer ends up like, there are too many versions of events that we will never know the truth. whereas the proactive messaging, it's more directed towards future events. And if I take this distinction as a given, I think it's obvious that the messaging related to the Ukrainian elections had to be proactive because they are not really reacting to some event in the past.
What I meant was this instance of them
Yeah.
and using them. Did Facebook respond quickly enough when that started happening? Do any of you know?
If they responded quickly enough on that, I'm not certain, but I can say, so on that particular incident, what we saw was what was happening, and we saw Facebook acknowledging, but I'm not certain of the response, so we can't say on that. But in terms of the platforms and how they prepared, I think the platforms are very clear that Ukraine is a testing ground for a lot of these info operations, and they did send teams out to Ukraine ahead of the elections, way ahead, in terms of just understanding. We know that Google did some trainings with the different candidates, that they try to, instill more security in terms of their emails and how they operate themselves. We know that Facebook had teams there as well. They banned political ads from being bought by foreign actors, which then prompted the Russian, this incident. So I think that they made an effort, whether sufficient or as proactive,
it was the piece of news from last week. They removed like 1,900 Facebook pages for inauthentic behavior. So it wasn't really based on the content that they are spreading, but more about, deceiving the consumers about who they really are. And it was 1,900 Russian linked. They didn't really say what it means precisely, but they said Russian linked web pages or Facebook pages or Facebook profiles. Yeah. So they took them down. So I don't know if it's a lot or if it's enough. I have no idea, but that's what they said.
All right. And then I know that do you still have your question?
Thank you, Viola Ganger from Just Security blog at NYU Law School on National Security Law and Policy. Two quick questions. One, and some of the responses have sort of touched on this, but I wanted to see if we could put a finer point on it. What is the degree of awareness among the Ukrainian public of Russian disinformation, what it looks like? I heard last week that there was some polling that showed the degree of awareness was actually remarkably low, and when they knew about, when they had heard about disinformation, they thought it was by their own government as opposed to by the Russians. So, and the second question is somewhat different, and that is, how would you rate the quality of information that Ukrainians received via television, which of course is the most viewed medium there, I believe, about the candidates? Did they get, do you believe, a sufficient amount of quality? We know there was lots of quantity, but how would you rate the quality of the information about the election for on television news?
I'm not sure. On the second question is, on the second, it goes beyond our mandate, so we're not prepared to answer about the quality of information that the Ukrainian people got from their news sources.
Well, there is the, we didn't cover it, that's true, but there is the OSCE report about the elections, and I think that they said that they were like minor irregularities that, the candidates probably could get a more equal coverage, but I think the conclusion was that there was nothing really major, so.
And
but
NDI,
maybe
well, NDI and IRI also mentioned it, so I would go to those sources for that. On the first, public awareness about disinformation, I think, do you want to start, Alexei, and then we'll go to Jakub?
David already mentioned our Razumkov Centre public opinion poll, and we did 2 polls, and actually Ukrainians are well aware about the Russian interference, and I assume that, well, we didn't ask separate questions what kind of interference, but mostly, I mean, all around Ukraine, it's about like 3/4 of Ukrainians are aware of Russian interference. And the second poll showed that there was even an increase in numbers. So I think this interference, including disinformation, was just growing throughout this very short course of 2 months. And even, I mean, the most interesting distribution was regional and age categories. And there we saw a very interesting picture, because I don't think that we have time, but it's published on our Ukrainian elections website. You can go and see there are plenty of numbers, but it's interesting to see the regional difference and age differences. You can also then use it for developing these counter-propaganda campaigns.
Okay, last question. What should we watch out for? What is the one piece that each of you will be following in the lead up to the next round?
Well, I think during 4 hours discussion, it was mentioned a couple of times why Russia is so interested in destabilizing Ukraine and destroying Ukraine as a prospective model. I just wonder why nobody mentioned transition in Kazakhstan. Because in the Russian media, not just in the media, in the Russian establishment, the Russian expert community, there was huge discussion. Because Kazakhstan showed to Russia kind of, not example, but maybe a model they could elaborate and use in 2024. And I think Ukraine, in this case, is perceived even more dangerous for Russia, because this is Kazakhstan, this is Russian model, and this is Ukraine. I mean, if the Russian people have this choice, I mean, Ukraine shows something positive, I'm sure we will do, then, you know, I agree with the speakers on the previous panel that it's not just the way to protect democracy, it's probably the way to probably change Russia in the future, to make it a better country. And my last point would be what I started with, the large-scale aggression. Also, we discussed that here in this room, that Russia makes, or Mr. Putin makes many mistakes, because his decision to 2014 to attack Ukraine was a huge mistake. It destroyed his image internationally, it delivered a lot of damage to Russian national interest, but it was a wrong decision, definitely. And now when we calculated, or my colleagues, experts, calculating the possibility of Russia attacking Ukraine, they say, no, 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 because of this and that and that. And it's absolutely logical. But again, we shouldn't forget that Putin has made already so many grave mistakes. And it makes him even more dangerous. And I would probably be very careful making any predictions for the next 3 weeks, next 3 months. And I think this is our common task and common duty to assist Ukraine, to help Ukraine, not just because we love Ukraine, I do, but I mean, because this is in our common interest. Thank you.
Jakub.
Well, I would be careful with the messaging that Putin has made so many mistakes, you know, and basically made him look like an idiot. Because the trouble is that he achieved some of the goals. I mean, he still occupies part of Georgia. Georgia is not part of NATO. He still occupies part of Moldova. He still occupies part of Ukraine, and Ukraine has no chance of becoming a NATO member very soon, unfortunately. I think it's a shame, but I'm a bit afraid that that's the fact. So some of the goals that Putin might have had, I believe he has achieved them. So I think we should still remember that he's a danger that we still need to fight. Before the second round of elections, I think we can expect that the Kremlin will continue to try and discredit the whole process. Definitely, I think that will be the number one goal, to basically delegitimize any future president, whoever it might be. He will not be picked by the Ukrainians. He will be picked in Washington, D.C., and the elections will be rigged and illegitimate. I think what to look out for, I would like to see whether they will try and promote one of the candidates. My suspicion is that they might, but we will have to see.
So my feeling over the next 3 weeks is that, especially in the cyber domain here, we don't see a shocking level of interference that you can put your finger on and say, look at Russia. really trying to tilt the scales here in one direction or the other between Poroshenko and Zelensky. But I do think that this is a critical moment for the Kremlin to think through how do you seed the ground for undermining a Zelensky presidency right off the bat. How do you weaken him, just a few weeks into his presidency, so that his mandate is as small as possible, so that his ability to negotiate with the West is it looks like he's a puppet to what the U.S. and the EU would want him to do. How do you basically delegitimize a leader coming in, right? So I think that's where the logic is, but we've all kind of spoken to the logic and the faulty aspect of using that too far here as well. So look, I just think we have to look beyond the election, though that's a little ironic to your question here. But what are the next steps if putting the Kremlin's fingerprints heavily over the next 3 weeks is not useful? What are the next options for Putin?
Just picking up on something Jakob said, because I can't resist. In the case of Ukraine, support for joining NATO was in the teens on a good day. After the invasion, it went above 50%. It is now in the Ukrainian constitution to join NATO in the European Union. And there is more unity around this issue than there was. So then the onus is on the West, as well as Ukraine, to decide whether it has the willingness and readiness to bring in countries that meet the criteria. And I think in the case of Georgia, we have seen some erosion in support for NATO because they were promised 11 years ago they would become members, and they haven't seen any real progress toward that goal. So I think in Ukraine it has been a setback for Putin, but it will be up to the West whether they allow Russian occupation of a country to constitute a de facto veto over a country's NATO aspirations. The things I would look for, and I would too, like Laura, go beyond the election, is Russia's economic situation and Putin's ratings. There is now, for the first time since before Crimea, more people who don't trust Putin than trust him. His approval rating, while pretty high by Western standards, is not high for Mr. Putin. And so if the economic situation does not improve, and I don't see any reason it will over the next few years, and if his numbers continue to drop, then whether it's the Belarus scenario that Andres talked about in the previous session, or more aggression against Ukraine, he won't be thinking in Western rational terms. He will be thinking in what serves his own personal interests, and that's where I think we need to be more imaginative in trying to anticipate what might happen.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.